Good morning. Welcome to UELMA 21 Virtual. We're welcome you this morning. We'd like to start with welcoming Emily DeJong. She's the UELMA president, and she will start our conference off. Welcome, Emily.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Hi, everybody. Welcome to UELMA 21 Virtual. I am so excited for this conference. Here we go. I wanted to thank our conference committee. As you know, this has been a weird year, and so this has been a really weird conference to prepare, and they've just done fantastic, and I know that y'all are going to have just a great day. We want to thank our exhibitors who, without their support, we wouldn't be able to put on our conference. Make sure that you take time to go and visit them and see the products that they have that can help support you in your library. For attendance, remember that you can get USBE credit and certificates. Remember to complete the conference evaluation form online. We do use that data to help us plan future conferences. And then also indicate whether you want to receive Midas credit. For prizes this year, we had some awesome autographed books and virtual author visits that were given away. And winners are going to be announced in our newsletters, and books will be delivered from our authors' local bookstores of choice. All right, so I wanted to give you a little update on our organization this year. So this year as an organization, we're included in a letter from AASL to President Biden's transition team, outlining the importance of certified school librarians in every school. Yay. 2, we gathered data from a survey on professional development. And it was very interesting that we learned the majority of respondents preferred pre-recorded professional development. And so that drove us to go ahead and dust off the cobwebs off the UELMA YouTube site and begin to add professional development videos that members can view at your leisure. And we're going to continue to work on that. We also wrote a letter to Murray School District Superintendent and other decision makers, outlining the importance of keeping the equity book bundle that the district was considering pulling from schools after a book challenge, and recently found out that they've decided to maintain the equity book bundle and keep the diverse books in their libraries. So we're very excited to hear that they made that decision. This year as individuals, we've proved how important we are for our schools and communities. When schools closed in March and school districts wondered how to continue to serve students, we all stepped up. No conference is complete without me crying, but what a year, you guys. We demonstrated flexibility by taking on the job of getting laptops to every student that needed one. I'm sure that some of you wish you could forget doing, because that was not my favorite thing. We advocated for free and reduced costs for internet, mobile internet hotspots, and hotspots that students could check out to ensure that all students had access to Wi-Fi so they could continue learning. We figured out ways to get books into our students' hands, whether by promoting and training students on how to use ebook services, getting donations to give students free books to take home, or by managing curbside checkouts that allowed students to safely have access to books. When districts needed someone to support teachers in learning how to use Canvas and other new technologies, school librarians throughout the state were called on to step up and learn the platform so we could support teachers, parents, and students. School librarians learned new technologies to provide library services to students, such as how to screencast, how to run effective library lessons over Zoom, and how to manage Canvas classes for an entire school building. School librarians have read research on how long books need to be quarantined so they're safe for students' use, sanitized desk computers and the library to ensure students can safely have access to information, and created policies and procedures to provide as open access as possible while keeping students and themselves safe. This pandemic has allowed us to show that we are flexible, lifelong learners, innovators, leaders, teachers, and absolutely indispensable in our school buildings and communities. For all the students, teachers, and communities you serve, thank you for going above and beyond this year. And I'm sorry I'm such a baby, but there you go. Don't forget that This next year, I was so excited when I learned that they're going to have ASL in Salt Lake City. They released that information 5 years ago, and I immediately sent out on Facebook. Anybody I know in the library world, we're hosting in 2021. If you've never been to a national conference, it is one for the books. You will go away having so much that you've learned. You'll get to see so many authors. You'll get all these free books, which we all love. So I would highly recommend that you consider joining in Salt Lake City. This is, it hasn't been here. We haven't had a ASL here for like 20 years. So please consider joining. And there is a discount through March 20th that you can see on that slide. And now I'm going to turn it over to Keith Smedberg, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Keith, can you hear us?
I can.
There we go.
Emily, you didn't warn me about those emotions. That's going to be hard to follow by me, but I am sure our keynote speaker can top you. Alan Gratz is the author of 17 novels for young readers, including Allies, Grenade, Prisoner B3087, Project 1065, 2019 Utah Beehive, nominee Refugee, and the #1 New York Times bestselling novel Ground Zero. He joins us live from his home in North Carolina. Welcome, middle grade author Alan Gratz.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Keith. And Emily, thank you for everything you and all the other librarians in Utah and across the country have been doing. I know what a difficult year this has been for everybody. And being a teacher or librarian is already hard enough. And you guys had so much more piled on top of you because of what has been going on the last year. So thank you. And thank you to everybody at UELMA for inviting me and for having me here to give the keynote this morning. So I'm going to share my screen here so that I can show you some images, and I'll be up here in the corner along the way. But let me see, I'm shrink something down here so I can see. So great. Thank you guys so much. Thank you for being here this morning. I know it's early for you guys. Thank you for getting up and spending the day with us. So I'm Alan Gratz. I was born and raised in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I went to the University of Tennessee where I studied creative writing because I knew from when I was the age of a lot of my young readers that I wanted to grow up and be a writer. So I graduated. I did a lot of other jobs while I was working on my writing. And then in 2006, I finally published my very first novel. That was Samurai Shortstop, the book that's up there in the corner. And I've been really lucky to have about a book a year come out ever since then. Now, I don't live in Knoxville anymore. As Keith mentioned, I live in North Carolina now, just a couple of hours away in a little town called Asheville up in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And this is my full-time job. I get to come down here to my office, which is where I'm sitting this morning, and I get to work on writing books all day long. And I think it is pretty much the greatest job in the world. And I'm going to tell you about some more of these books and a little bit more about my philosophy behind some of these books as we go along this morning. I thought I would focus my talk today on my recent red letter books, or at least that's what I've heard a lot of kids call them because they have a red font on the front cover. I suppose it's as good a name for the collection of books as any. But these are my books from Scholastic. And I thought I would give a brief introduction to some of the earlier books in case you're less familiar with them. But then at the end, go into depth about 3 of the more recent ones, about my inspiration behind those and a little bit more information behind those. And then wrap things up with some deep thoughts, if you will, about the books that I've become well known for. So I want to start with Prisoner B3087. Prisoner B3087 is based on the true story of a man named Jack Gruner. Jack was just 10 years old when Nazi Germany invaded his home country of Poland to start World War II. And after spending time in a Jewish ghetto in Krakow, he was separated from his family and taken away and imprisoned in what would be the first of 10 different Nazi concentration camps during World War II. Incredibly, Jack survived and lived to tell his tale. I got to meet him a few years back, and I worked with him to tell his story. Jack passed away, I guess, about 3 years ago now. And I'm really honored and proud to be a part of keeping his incredible story alive now that he's gone. After prisoner B3087 came Code of Honor. Code of Honor is the story of a high school senior named Cameron Smith, who is Persian American. That means his mom was born in Iran, but he was born here in the United States. The thing Cameron wants most in the world is to grow up and follow in the footsteps of his older brother, Darius, who's a United States Army Ranger serving in Afghanistan. But then one day, Cameron's older brother goes online claiming credit for a terrorist attack against the United States. And suddenly everyone thinks that Cameron and his whole family are terrorists, and he has to go on the run from the US government to prove his older brother's innocence and potentially stop another huge terrorist attack against the United States. In Project 1065, I went back to World War II for a story of a kid named Michael, who is Irish, but he lives in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany, because his dad is the Irish ambassador to Germany. Because he's a kid living in Nazi Germany during the war, he has to join the Hitler Youth, which is, of course, like the Nazi Boy Scouts. It's where boys were trained to grow up to be soldiers for Adolf Hitler. And Michael and his family, they hate the Nazis. They hate Hitler and they hate everything he stands for, but they smile and they pretend to get along with the Nazis because they have a secret. In addition to being ambassadors and diplomats, Michael and his family are also spies. They're collecting information about Nazi Germany and sending it back to England and America to help us win the war against them in World War II. Grenade is a story about the Battle of Okinawa, which was the last major battle of World War II. The Battle of Okinawa was fought between the United States and Japan. And I got to go to Japan about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago. It was the trip of a lifetime. And while I was there, I met an older man who had been a kid on the island of Okinawa during the battle. And he told me an incredible story. He said the day the United States invaded to try and take his island from Japan, the Japanese army pulled all the Okinawan middle school boys out of school, took them outside, lined them up, and gave each of them a grenade. And the Japanese army told them, go off in the forest with your grenade and don't come back until you've used it to kill an American soldier. That's the very first chapter of Grenade, and what my kid, Hideki, does with his grenade, well, that's the rest of the story. But that's usually a pretty good hook to get kids reading the rest of the way. And then, of course, there is Refugee. And here I want to go into a little bit more detail because this is a book that a lot of you have shared with your young readers, either individually or as a class or as an entire school. No matter how you've shared this book, thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing it. So let me tell you a little bit more about how this book came to be. The story of Refugee began for me with the MS St. Louis. That's the ship right there at the top of the screen. The MS St. Louis was a real ship, and it left Nazi Germany in 1939 with more than 900 Jewish refugees on board, many of whom had already been in concentration camps like Jack Runer. But this was right before the war, and the Nazis had more prisoners than they had prison camps. So they would throw you in there, they would beat you, torture you, starve you, and if you survived, they would kick you back out again to make room for new prisoners. And they would tell you, you've got 2 weeks to get out of our country or we'll do it again. So many people bought the first ticket out of town that they could. And for many of them, it was this ship, the MS St. Louis. So the MS St. Louis was bound for Cuba, where some of the refugees hoped to live permanently and many more planned to live temporarily while they waited to immigrate to the United States. So they pull into Havana Harbor and all the refugees have their suitcases in hand and they're ready to go and live in Cuba. And that's when the Cuban government said, we changed our mind and you can't come in. The Jewish refugees are like, but we filled out all our paperwork. We paid all our fees. We sailed across the ocean to get here. If we go back to Germany, they're going to kill us. And the Cuban government said, not our problem, and still wouldn't let them in. So the ship sails north up the east coast of the United States. And they begged the United States, please, will you let us in so we don't have to go back to Germany where they're going to kill us? And the United States said, no. So they sailed north to Canada and they're like, please, will you let us in? If we go back to Germany, they're going to kill us. And Canada said, no. No one wanted these refugees. So now they have nowhere to go, and they're running out of food and water and fuel for their ship. So they turn around and they go back to Europe. They don't have to go back to Germany. Thankfully, they found 4 countries that agreed to take them in. But 3 of those countries were right next door to Germany. And when World War II broke out just a month and a half later, most of those refugees were right in the way of Hitler and his armies, who captured them and took them back to concentration camps where many of them died. And none of them had to die if somebody somewhere said, we got this, we'll take you in, we'll give you refuge. I wanted to write a book about the MS St. Louis for young readers, and I was still in the process of trying to figure out who my characters would be and what my story would be when my family and I went on vacation down to Florida. And one morning we got up and we said, hey, let's go for a walk on the beach, which is where we found this. It was a raft that someone had used to come to the United States. You can see in the pictures it was homemade, built out of plywood and 2x6s. The outside of the raft, the blue part, is metal from a shed roof. The yellow stuff in the bottom left picture, that's like great stuff. It's like the stuff we buy at the hardware store that we spray as insulation around windows and doors. They had sprayed it all in the bottom of the raft and up the cracks of it to seal up all the cracks. I thought that was really clever. On the outside, in the top picture, you can see empty gas cans were hanging off the side. That's because there was an engine mounted in the back, like stripped out of a tractor or motorcycle. I don't know what, I'm not an engine guy. That ran a propeller down buried in the sand back behind it. And you can see on the inside, we found wet clothes, empty bottles of water, half-eaten bags of food, anything they could take with them to help them survive. No one was on board this raft when we found it. It was already abandoned. To this day, I don't know what happened to the people who were on it. I hope they made it here safely. I've never known. I also don't know where they came from. My best guess has always been that they came from Cuba, because that's the closest of the Caribbean countries to southern Florida. But that's still 90 miles away, right? 90 miles away across open sea. I wouldn't want to go fishing in that thing, let alone take it that far to come here to have what we have. But that's exactly what somebody had done. My family and I, we were stunned by this. We walked around it. We talked about it. It made us think about all the things that we take for granted: the roof over our heads, the food on our plates, the freedom and safety that we enjoy as American citizens. And me personally, I was like, what am I doing? Why am I writing about refugees 75 years ago when we have refugees right here, right now, 100 yards away from where I was sleeping last night? Why am I not telling that story? So the whole time I'm thinking about these thoughts, I'm watching, of course, images of the Syrian civil war and the Syrian refugee crisis on the news and on the internet. The Syrian civil war started in 2011 and is still going on. The Syrian government is fighting with Syrian rebels. Kurdish rebels have tried to take over parts of the country. ISIS, a terrorist group, has taken over parts of Syria. Iran has joined the fight in support of the government. Russian fighters have dropped bombs on Syria. American battleships have fired missiles into Syria, some as recently as just a week ago. And the people who are caught in the middle are the Syrian people. Since the beginning of the Syrian war, close to 12 million Syrians have lost their homes. 12 million is more people than live in the entire city of New York, which has got a population of 8.5 million. It's more people than live in all but 6 US states. And Utah is not one of them. So there's more people than live in Utah. Only California, Texas, Florida, New York, Illinois, and Pennsylvania have more people in them than Syria. So imagine taking everybody that lived in New York City, or everybody in Utah for that matter, or everybody in almost any US state, and making every one of them homeless over the last 10 years. That's the kind of refugee crisis we'd be dealing with here, and that they are dealing with currently in the Middle East. Roughly half of those people, about 5.5 million people, have left their country looking for some other place to live. Many of them end up in refugee camps in countries next door like Jordan or Turkey, but many more people are pushing on to the European Union for safety and refuge. And maybe you've seen pictures like the one here at the bottom right, with refugees in orange life vests crammed into black rubber rafts trying to get across the Mediterranean Sea to places like Greece or Italy. But this is a really dangerous water crossing too. In 2016, at the height of the crisis, an estimated 5,000 people died trying to make that water crossing, and more are dying every year. And none of them had to die if somebody somewhere said, "We got this. We'll take you in. We'll give you refuge." Okay, so you can imagine what I'm thinking now. First, I wanted to write a book about Jewish refugees. Then I wanted to write a book about Cuban refugees. Now I want to write a book about Syrian refugees. And I was like, which of these books do I write first? They're all really important stories. I was like, wait, why do I have to write 3 different books? What if I wrote one book and I put all 3 stories in it? And that's how Refugee was born. Refugee then is the story of 3 different kids. All 3 characters are fictional. I made them up. But every single thing that happens to them really happened to someone on one of those journeys in one of these time periods. It's the story of Joseph, who leaves Nazi Germany with his family and more than 900 other Jewish refugees on board the MS St. Louis, bound for freedom and safety in Cuba in the 1930s. It's the story of Isabel, who escapes Cuba in the 1990s with her family and her next door neighbor's family on board a raft very much like the one I found on the beach, bound for freedom and safety in Florida. And it's the story of Mahmoud, who leaves Syria on foot with his family to try and get to Germany for freedom and safety in the present day. And I weave all 3 of the stories together. So you get a chapter from Joseph, then a chapter from Isabel, then a chapter from Mahmoud, all the way out. So you can see the parallels in their lives. And also in the end, so you can see how each of these characters and their families are actually connected across the thousands of miles and the decades that separate them. And that, of course, is a big spoiler, which I won't share here in case you haven't read the book. But I hope you will read Refugee. And if you haven't already, and that you'll share it with young readers in your lives. And I hope, too, that when and if you do, that it does for you and for your young readers what finding that raft on the beach did for me all those years ago. I hope that it takes something that might be invisible to you, the refugee crisis in the world, and makes it visible either again or maybe for the first time. So thank you again for sharing Refugee with your young readers if you've been doing that. I believe this is my only book to be nominated for the Utah Beehive Award. So thank you guys for that as well. Next up, I want to talk about allies. In 2019, to correspond with the 75th anniversary of the event, I published Allies, a story of D-Day. D-Day, of course, was June 6, 1944, and it was a huge day in World War II history, and arguably an even bigger day in human history. It was the day that the Allied powers came together to invade Nazi-occupied France and to begin to drive the Nazis back to Germany. So there were tens of thousands of planes and ships and tanks at D-Day, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers. And when I set out to write this book, I thought that was going to be the whole story. I thought it was going to be this straight up war story about soldiers coming off those flat-bottomed Higgins boats and rushing up the beach and getting pinned down and eventually fighting their way up and over the dunes to the bunkers on the hill, and that it would end with my main character pushing on into France. And that's certainly the heart of D-Day. But when I actually started doing the research for this book, I realized there were so many other people involved in D-Day who sacrificed so much to make that day a success, people whose stories weren't often told. And I realized I had to tell those stories in this book too. There were women in the French Resistance, for example, who fought alongside the men to free their country from Nazi rule and looked very stylish while doing it, I might add. There were Algerian Muslims in the French Resistance and the Free France Army as well. Algeria was a French colony at the time. The Algerians wanted their freedom, and they figured they had a better chance of getting it from France than from Nazi Germany. So many Algerians joined the resistance and fought to liberate France. But then after the war, France went back on their promise to liberate them, and the Algerians had to fight a bloody war for independence in the 1950s. There were Black soldiers at D-Day too, though we don't often see them in fictional depictions of the battle. The main reason for that is because the Black soldiers weren't in the first round of soldiers to hit the beaches at 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning. The U.S. Army was segregated during World War II, and Black soldiers and white soldiers both served, but not alongside each other, not with each other in battle. So they sent the white soldiers onto the beaches first at 6:30 and 7:30 in the morning, and then planned to have the Black units follow them around 10 a.m. once the battle was over, to set up barrage balloons and supply depots and sweep the beaches for mines, do a lot of the support work for the rest of the troops who would follow that first invasion and pour into Europe. But the battle wasn't over by 10 a.m., not by a long shot. The Army thought we would be up and off the beach by 10, but we weren't up and off the beaches until like 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Most of the soldiers got pinned down by the Germans and weren't able to make any progress until much later in the day. So here, but being the Army, they deliver these black soldiers right on time. So the doors of their boats drop down. They've got all their equipment in hand. They're ready to go up and set up barrage balloons and sweep the beaches for mines. Suddenly they're getting shot at by German machine guns. So the black soldiers, they drop all their equipment. They cut loose the barrage balloons. They grab their rifles and they rush out into the battle, fighting right alongside the white soldiers. And guess what? The white soldiers and the black soldiers fought great together. Duh. It was one of the first times in American history that black and white soldiers served together in the same battle, fighting alongside each other. And it was a big reason that soon after World War II, the U.S. Army became one of the first American institutions to desegregate. There were Jewish soldiers in the U.S. Army too, of course, and they faced religious prejudice and persecution from their fellow soldiers. At the same time, they were all fighting their way across Europe to liberate Nazi concentration camps. And there were other women at D-Day too. There were nurses on board the big medical ships that operated as floating hospitals just a little ways from the beaches. And there were women reporters too. One woman, Martha Gellhorn, disguised herself as a soldier and made her way into the beaches that day with a stretcher crew from one of the hospital ships, becoming the first and only American woman to set foot on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Many would follow, but she was the first. I tell all those stories and more in Allies, which I hope, like D-Day, proves that we are stronger when we work together. You know, I often tell people that I write about history because we should learn from the mistakes of the past. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, is the famous line. But sometimes I do think we got it right. And I think D-Day is a big example of when we got it right. And it's good to hold up those examples as well. Oh, and if your students really enjoy Allies, there is a companion novella available called Resist that follows the adventures of Samira Zidan, a French-Algerian girl who's a part of the French resistance and one of the stories in Allies. I wrote this novella as a free giveaway for Scholastic's book clubs, and it proved so popular that Scholastic has re-released it for sale as an ebook. There is unfortunately not a physical copy of it for sale. So I know that many of you want to add this to your library shelves, and I want you to add it to your library shelves. I don't know why, but Scholastic has only re-released this as an ebook and an audiobook. There are physical copies of this out there because I wrote it and they printed above us those free copies for the fairs. But if you go online and you look for them, they're like cost $50. Do not buy this for $50. It is seriously like a 100-page paperback, and it is not worth $100. So don't buy one of the used copies. People are just jacking up the prices online because they know that it's rare. If you're some collector and you think it's going to be worth something, go for it. I won't tell you not to, but I guess. But don't do it for regular circulation in a library. It's totally not worth it. But they do have the ebook, and they have an amazing audiobook. All the audiobooks for the Scholastic stuff are pretty great. But if you have a young reader who is a big fan of Allies and wants more, there is a little bit more out there in the form of Resist. And last, but definitely not least, I want to tell you about my new book, Ground Zero, which is a story of 9/11. Young readers have been asking me for years to write a book about 9/11, and I finally decided to do it for this year because 2021 is, wait for it, yes, the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks. That was a stunner to me when I first realized it, and maybe it is to you if you haven't thought about it yet. On September 11th, 2001, I was an 8th grade English teacher in Knoxville, Tennessee. That's a picture of me in my classroom, relaxing, one of the few times I could relax as a teacher. That is not obviously a picture from September 11th. We had a lot of other things to worry about that day, but it's the same school year. My wife, Wendy, and I had actually been in New York City earlier that year and had gone up to the top of the World Trade Center for an event at Windows on the World the restaurant at the top of the 107th floor of the North Tower. That's us on that trip there in the bottom picture, not at the top of the World Trade Center, which we visited later that night. That's us at the top of the Empire State Building. We went to the top of a couple of tall buildings that day to get some views. But let's go back to September 11th, 2001. That was a Tuesday. And back at my school in Tennessee, we had just started our first class of the day when news of the attack started filtering into our classrooms. We pulled all of the students out of class and assembled as a school in the gym, where we wheeled in blurry TVs with bad reception as all of us, teachers and students, struggled to understand what was going on in New York. And remember, this was before Twitter. It was before Facebook. It was before most people had cell phones. I didn't get my first cell phone until 2002, when my wife was pregnant and we wanted to make sure she could reach me wherever I was. And nobody's cell phone was a smartphone, not back then. Without social media to turn to, we turned to the people next to us with the questions we were all asking. What was going on? Why would someone do this? Would there be more attacks? Were we now at war? And with whom? When the Twin Towers collapsed less than 2 hours later, there was only one thing we all knew for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. I tell the story of that day from the point of view of 9-year-old Brandon, who is in the World Trade Center on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Brandon is already in trouble. He got into a fight in the first week of school, defending a friend against a bully, and now he is suspended. He and his dad live alone, so Brandon has to go into work with his dad at Windows on the World, the restaurant at the very top of the North Tower of the World Trade Center up on the 107th floor. This is the restaurant that my wife and I visited earlier that year in February, a place world famous for its incredible views, as you can see in this picture. Brandon's in trouble with his dad and his school, but he has a plan to fix things, starting with sneaking out of the restaurant and taking an elevator all the way down to the mall in the basement of the World Trade Center. But Brandon's only made it a few floors when, boom, terrorists drive a jet plane into the building above him, cutting him off from his dad. Now Brandon has to figure out how to survive and see if there's a way he can save his dad too. I could have just written a book about a boy surviving in the North Tower on September 11th, 2001. But the message of that day was Muslim terrorists are coming to kill us. And that day they were. But that's not what has happened in the 20 years since 9/11. And it wouldn't address how the United States and the world have changed since the attacks. One of the biggest effects of 9/11, of course, is the war in Afghanistan, which began the month after the terrorist attacks and is still going on 19 years later. There are young soldiers fighting in Afghanistan for the United States who weren't even born when the United States invaded in October of 2001. Since then, almost 2,400 American soldiers have died in Afghanistan, and more than 20,000 have been wounded. By contrast, more than 65,000 members of the Afghan National Army, our allies in Afghanistan, the local Afghans we've trained and who fight alongside us, have died. And an estimated 40,000 Afghan civilians have been killed by both sides in the war. And estimates vary, but the financial cost of the war in Afghanistan is thought to be close to $975 billion. The war in Afghanistan is now the longest war in US history, and it is still going on. I knew if I was going to write about 9/11 20 years later, I was going to have to tell the story of what has happened since then, including the war in Afghanistan. So the second kid in my story is Reshmina, an 11-year-old Afghan girl who experiences her own 9/11 in the present day as her village becomes a battleground between the United States and the Taliban. Reshmina's native language in Afghanistan is Pashto, but her English is very good, and she's hoping to get a job as a teacher or a translator to help her family. So when American soldiers visit her village for the first time, she's excited to try out her English skills. But almost as soon as they've arrived, the Americans are attacked by the Taliban, a group of fighters who follow an extreme interpretation of Islam and want all foreigners gone from Afghanistan. Even though it's dangerous, Reshmina's family takes in one of the wounded American soldiers into their home to protect him, something that really happened to an American Navy SEAL whose team was ambushed by the Taliban in 2005. But Reshmina's twin brother, Pasoon, blames the United States for their older sister's death in a drone attack, and he runs away to tell the Taliban where to find the wounded American soldier. Now Reshmina has to go after her brother and try to stop him before the Taliban come back and destroy her village. Like September 11th and the war in Afghanistan, Reshmina and Brandon are connected. Both will have to make impossible decisions along the way where something bad will happen no matter what they choose to do, and each will try to take on the extreme challenges that face them alone, but come to learn that the only way they can survive, the only way any of us can survive, I think, is when we work together and not against each other. And like the characters in Refugee, Brandon and Reshmina are connected too across the decades and the thousands of miles that separate them. But to find out what that connection is, just like Refugee, again, you have to go and read the book. I can't give you too many spoilers this morning. So that's a little bit about me and my latest books. Now for the deep thoughts part of the program that I promised at the outset. Okay, so I get a ton of fan mail from young readers about my books, which I love. The best ones are from middle schoolers who say, I've read every one of your books and I can't wait for more. Or high schoolers who write and say, I've never finished a book until I read Code of Honor and now I've read it 4 times. The worst letters, usually emails that come in around 10 o'clock at night, say things like, I have a book report due tomorrow. Can you tell me the theme of Project 1065? Or I have to find 5 quotes each about perseverance and coming of age in Refugee, but I can't find any. Can you please give me some examples with page numbers? That was an actual email that I got. It was the girl's assignment to show why she should get into advanced English, she told me. Good luck with that. I get a lot of letters and emails from teachers and librarians as well. And the best part is you guys almost never ask me what the themes of my books are. Instead, you tell me things like, I started reading your book out loud to my class and they cry and beg for more every time I have to stop. I love hearing that. Or a student came to me and told me I had to read your book and told all his friends they had to read it too. Also awesome. When I started to get letters like this and the good ones from young readers, I stepped back and I tried to figure out what it was that I was doing right, because obviously I wanted to write more books like that. And I never set out to write books for reluctant readers or what Donald Miller calls dormant readers. I was just writing the kind of books that I wanted to read personally and that I would have wanted to read as a kid. But then when I think back on my own childhood, I realize I was a dormant reader, which is odd to say because I was also a good reader. That is, my reading comprehension skills, my vocabulary, my attention span, they were all good enough that I was able to sit and read and enjoy books like The Hobbit and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in grade school. They're still 2 of my favorites that I've reread. But I didn't have my nose buried in a book all through middle school and high school the way my wife did, and I dare say a lot of you did. The truth is, I didn't read very many books on my own outside of class when I was a kid. I was that student in your classroom. I was more likely to be out in the woods building a fort or playing video games or having an adventure with my Star Wars action figures and also still wearing hats. The point is that a book had to grab me by the collar of my members only jacket to compete with all the other things I enjoyed doing. And it was the rare book that managed to entice me. So when I started writing my own books, I wrote the kind of books I would have wanted to read as a kid. That meant getting to the story as quickly as I could in the first chapter, if possible. It meant stories with high stakes, life or death kind of stuff that really mattered. Short chapters with cliffhanger endings, dynamic settings, and relatable characters you care about. My number one goal when I write a book is to write a book a young reader can't put down. That's what we all want, right? The kind of book you can't wait to get back to, the kind of book that you want to recommend from the rooftops, the kind of book that turns a dormant reader into an avid reader and an avid reader into an evangelical reader. Not a religious evangelical reader, but you know what I mean. But in trying to understand what it was that made kids so crazy about my books, I realized there was something more to it than just a fast plot and high stakes and short chapters and characters that you care about. I was struggling to put my finger on exactly what it was until I listened to a podcast interview with Jordan Peele, the writer and director of the movie Get Out. He referred to his film as a social thriller. And that's when it clicked for me. It wasn't just that my books were thrilling reads. They had a social element to them too that appealed to kids. My books tackled bigger social issues beyond the thrills. How do you make sense of senseless evil? What is it like to be Middle Eastern in America post 9/11? How does someone who was bullied become a bully themselves? What is a refugee, and how could anyone turn them away? What kind of horrors are we capable of when we demonize and dehumanize others? What about the stories of all the marginalized people who fought and served and died at D-Day only to return home to face the same discrimination and prejudice and persecution they had faced before the war? And if every act of vengeance demands more revenge, how does the cycle of violence ever end? Social thrillers, books that entertain but challenge young readers to think as well. And more middle grade readers are choosing to read books like mine that tackle social issues because the social issues have come to them. They've been going through active shooter drills since they were in elementary school. They have refugees and immigrants as classmates. They hear racist and intolerant rhetoric from political leaders on the news. They're marching in Black Lives Matter protests. Middle grade readers don't have the luxury of thinking only about home and school and the neighborhood anymore. They are shaping their views of the larger world right now in grade school because the world is forcing them to. And that, I think, is why middle schoolers in particular have responded so enthusiastically to my books. Because beyond writing a story they can't put down, I'm also tackling questions they themselves have about the larger world. My books, like Jordan Peele's Get Out, are social thrillers. That's become my watchword, my little category on the shelf. How do I do it? How do I tackle social issues in a way that young readers respond to? By taking statistics and giving them a name, a face. This is Brandon. This is Reshmina. This is how Brandon crawled through a hole in the wall to escape a collapsing elevator, only to come back to save the other 4 people still trapped inside and make sure they were not among the 2,977 people who died in the Twin Towers that day. This is how Reshmina, a girl whose older sister had been killed in a U.S. drone attack, hid a wounded American soldier in her home to make sure he was not among the more than 2,300 U.S. soldiers who have been killed in Afghanistan since 2001. To bring history to life, to bring a crisis to life, is to make it personal, to make it unique, and at the same time, typical. That is the job of story. That is the power of story, to turn statistics into people who come to life for us on the page, to turn numbers into characters we cry for and care for and root for. Books build empathy. Empathy leads to compassion, and compassion brings change. Books can change the world. And that's where you come in. As teachers and librarians, you are in the incredible position to put just the right book in the right hands at the right moment. You know which kid needs pure escapist fiction today. You know which kid needs something easy and familiar. You know which kid needs something challenging. You know which kid needs a silly graphic novel or a book about bullying or a book about rainbow-colored unicorns. As just one example, let me end with another piece of fan mail, this one from a boy named Jack, who wrote to me a few years ago. This is a real letter. It's going to seem like I wrote this to fit this speech, but I actually wrote the speech to fit this letter. It's such an incredible letter. He says, "Hi, Alan Gratz. My name is Jack. I am 13 years old and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I've only read Prisoner B3087 and your new book, Refugee, but I can't tell you how many times I've reread Prisoner B3087. I never liked to read until my librarian recommended I check out Prisoner B3087. I've always loved World War II. When I first got the book, I thought the first couple of chapters were very intriguing. As I read on, this poor kid's life was pretty much failing all around it. It was horrible to find out about the concentration camps and learning what horrible things the Nazis did to these innocent people who are the exact same as you and me. Although it was a horrible time in history, I love how you taught it to so many kids. I loved Prisoner B3087, and I hope you write more books just like it. Don't even get me started on Refugee. This is easily my new favorite book of all time, and I've read a ton of books since Prisoner B3087. I like that. Alan, you amaze me of how many different ways you are able to write books. I like the constant flow of Prisoner B3087, but I really like the cliffhangers at the end of each Refugee chapter. Then you don't get to find out what really happened until 2 chapters later. Some people I know get angry about cliffhangers like that, but I watch The Walking Dead. I'm used to cliffhangers. Now I love when books have different people's points of view because I love to see and hear what their mind is picturing and thinking about. I am very impressed with Refugee. You opened me up to so many different books from Prisoner B3087 on. I'm asking for Project 1065 for my birthday tomorrow. I really want all your books for Christmas. Thank you so much for opening me up to reading. Thank you, Jack. Real letter, I promise. Thank you so much for opening me up to reading. That's what happens when a kid finds exactly the right book at exactly the right time. And that is what you do. That is the superpower of an exceptional librarian, an outstanding teacher, to put exactly the right book in the right hands at the right time. That is how you are building empathy in your students today and preparing them to be readers for life. Thank you again for continuing to share my books with your young readers and for continuing to have conversations with them about issues like those my books confront. Thank you, too, for everything you are doing to teach students through this pandemic. We heard from Emily at the top, all the extra things, the extraordinary things that you guys are doing, have been doing this past year and more. Teaching wasn't easy to begin with. I know I was one once, and the pandemic has made it exponentially harder. You guys are awesome. Thank you for everything you do. And thank you again for having me as the keynote speaker here at UELMA. I hope you guys will stay safe, stay sane, and keep reading. Keith, I'll invite you back on here now, and we can say goodbye. I'll be around later on for questions and answers. We've got another session for me for a Q&A, and I'll also be on a panel with a lot of other incredible authors later this morning. So I hope you guys will tune in for all of those. But Keith, if you're back, we'll say goodbye. Hey, thank you again.
That was powerful, Alan. Thank you so much. Having to wrap this up, and I will have to admit that it was Refugee that made me a Gratz fanboy. So thank you for that. It's a pleasure to have you in our conference, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person and possibly out here in ASL in the fall.
I'd love to be there.
That, oh, awesome. Well, again, we look forward to it. There's not going to be a question and answer period. Alan has his own coming up shortly. So again, thank you, Alan Gratz. It has been a pleasure, and especially for me personally, to get to introduce you. So thank you again.
All right. Thank you guys again. I think they're going to shut down the room, and so everybody will have to re-log in to the new room, but I will see you again soon. Thank you again.
Thanks.